This is Jed Disler, and welcome to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. There have been numerous concerts and celebrations and recording projects to mark the 150th anniversary of American composer Charles Ives' birth in 1874. I'll never forget hearing his music for the first time when I was around 12 years old. I was at music camp, and one of our counselors played a recording of the last movement of Ives' Second Symphony. And I remember I just went bananas over the mixture of sheer cacophony and chaos and all of those American patriotic tunes and marches popping out at the texture. It was so wild and so elemental to my mind. Yet also the music conveyed so much humor to me. And I don't think I had heard music with such a sense of humor outside of Bugs Bunny cartoons. Clearly, I had not yet been exposed to a great deal of Haydn as an adolescent. Otherwise, I would have said, yeah, I know a funny composer, Haydn. But Ives could be funny too. And I felt a similar joy and exhilaration in my first year at college when the Ives centenary came around. That was 1974. You see, I'm giving my age away. I imprinted on Ives' piano music through Alan Mandel's recordings of the more or less complete piano works issued on the Desto label on 4 LPs. These had like the worst LP surfaces ever. They defined snap, crackle, and pop. Later, they came out on CD on the Vox label, and you didn't have the snap, crackle, and pop. And then, later on, I learned how John Kirkpatrick, who was still very much alive and active in the 1970s, how he was the pianist who had given the second piano sonata, the Concord Sonata, its world premiere. So naturally, I had to check out his stereo recording on Columbia Masterworks, which was in our college library. It's absolutely terrific, by the way, and it's on CD. His premiere recording for Columbia, issued on 78s, I think around 1945, is also terrific. That was reissued very early on in the LP era, but it's never been digitized so far as I know. The Concord Sonata's 4 movements were named after 4 of New England's leading writers and intellectuals: Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Bronson Alcott, who was a minister and the father of the writer Louisa May Alcott, and lastly, Henry David Thoreau. This is music that goes between the most touching lyricism and repose and the most combative, curmudgeon-y piano writing of its time, or of any time for that matter. Ives had the sonata published twice, the first time in 1919 and then again in 1947. The 1947 edition had many revisions, largely making consonant passages more dissonant. And even after the 1947 score was published, Ives kept adding things to the mix, most extensively in the opening Emerson movement. I'm not going to go into extensive detail about the various editions and Ives' composing process, because that's a topic that's much better served by musicologists and program note writers. But I do want to talk about the pianist Donald Berman's new recording of the Concord Sonata, released this year on the Avi label. Don played an amazing performance of the Concord in concert without an audience. It was filmed during COVID, and I was really impressed, not just by his meticulous attention to detail and pure, unbridled energy, but also by the fact that Don was playing by memory. I mean, who plays the Concord Sonata from memory? I think there have been a few brave souls out there who've done so. Now, Donald Berman studied with John Kirkpatrick, who was a mentor of his, and Donald basically inherited the mantle from Kirkpatrick as the Ives piano music's keeper of the flames, so to speak. Whereas John Kirkpatrick decided that Ives' first thoughts on the Concord should be adhered to instead of the revisions, and that's reflected in his 1968 recording that I mentioned earlier. Donald Berman actually holds the opposite view. He feels that Ives' final thoughts are what one should consider, and Donald's recording of the Concord does incorporate all of the changes explicitly or implicitly indicated by Ives. And in the final Thoreau movement, Donald forgoes the option to have a flute join in at the end. And he actually plays that optional added flute line on the piano. Most pianists haven't done that, but Donald does, and it just works wonderfully well. But what I love about Donald Berman's playing of the Concord Sonata is that how he builds the textures from the ground up. I say that a lot when I talk about Brahms music, but there is a kind of Brahmsian cast to much of the piano writing, but what I mean is that Don pays close attention to voice leading, and he really pays attention to how the bass lines move. Although Ives can shift his tempos around in a seemingly arbitrary manner, Don figures out a way to address that feeling of improvisation and spontaneity by making intelligent and sensible modifications in order to clarify the shape of a theme or to build a climax toward its logical or illogical conclusion. And I also like in this performance how the normally lyrical and tuneful Alcott's movement comes off with much more of an edge than usual. It's less rounded off or Chopinized, perhaps. Certainly not sentimental or mawkish at all in Donald Berman's hands. Donald precedes his performance of the Concord Sonata with a marvelous and quite gripping curtain raiser. It's a piece called The St. Gaudens, which is subtitled Black March. Everything about this disc is really ideal. The production values are wonderful, from Adam Abeshouse's engineering to Donald Berman's extensive and scholarly and really insightful annotations. As I often say on these podcasts, I would not want to be without X recording of Y work, and I'm not going to give up my Concord Sonata recordings of John Kirkpatrick or Stephen Mayer or Jeremy Dank or both of Marc-Andre Hamelin's versions. I actually wrote the booklet notes for Mark's Hyperion remake of the Concord. And I still love that Alan Mandel recording that I spoke about earlier. There's also a fabulous version from the early 1960s of the Concord featuring the German pianist Alois Kontarski. Also, Pierre-Laurent Aimard played the Concord excellently, too. We're really spoiled for choice when it comes to the Concord on disc. However, for its sheer authority in terms of pianism and music making, as well as presenting the revised version of the Concord in more or less idealized manifestation, Donald Berman's Ives Concord Sonata easily belongs in this work's top tier of recordings. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. So thank you for tuning in, and please spread the good word about this podcast. And I look forward to being together with you for the next episode.